Everybody for coming down and braving the storm. It's kind of quieting down a bit, so I think we'll be alright for going home, but thank you nonetheless. Also, it goes without saying that tonight's presentation is my own views, obviously, nothing to do with the college, but we are here in one of the rooms, but yeah, obviously not a position associated at all with college, just my own meanderings. Okay, alright, so you can see there. My name is Christiaan Merwe. I'm a proto-teacher in maths and physics. I say proto-teacher because I haven't quite graduated yet, but I've basically finished. And then also a professional armchair philosopher, which is not too more in terms of that. Okay, moving on. So, Deflating the Conflict Thesis is the title for tonight. So I'll quickly run through that, what the conflict thesis is, sort of the historical basis, philosophical, cultural, whatever, we'll pour into that. I've also called it a myth. I did that intentionally, but not for maybe the reason you're thinking. The definition of myth historically is not something that is inherently false. It's just from the Greek mythos, or Latin mythos. Could be a story or narrative in general. So, as we know, false stories, they could contain true elements, false elements. It's kind of a mixed match of true and false, but myth captures story, narrative. Okay, so this is a modern story or narrative that we'll be going through with some true bits and not true bits, and a philosophical dissection. So, I'm not a historian or a cultural anthropologist, so I won't be diving too deep into those kind of sides of it. More the philosophical side is how I came into this. Obviously, there is a lot of history there. So, and then I promised to reconcile faith, reason, and science. And if it wasn't enough to already in 45 minutes, that last bit should be pretty easy to do. No, it won't be, but I'm going to try and do it anyway. Alright, so the conflict thesis. What are the major contentions? Is it tenable? What actually is it? So I split it up into the historical side, the cultural side. I'm going to lump them together because generally those things kind of go together. And the rhetorical or the philosophical side we'll get to after, save the desserts for after, so to speak. So in brief, the conflict thesis first appeared in the late 19th century, so 1870s, and so the main proponents are John William Draper and Andrew Dickinson White. And essentially what they were saying is there's an inescapable and inherent conflict between science and religion. These things are oil and water, they just do not mix. Alright, so our first contender is John William Draper. So, physician, chemist, and photographer. I think he's actually credited with taking one of the first, if not the first, photo of the moon, so that's pretty cool. He was also United States ambassador to Russia. Take from that what you will. It is somewhat surprising that, given his interest, that he's best known for his book on history and religion, of all things. It was published in 1874 under the request of Edward Livingston Humans, who was basically just an American popularizer. I was like, hey, can you write this book for me on the history of science and religion? And he said, sure, and I'll call it A History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And in this book, he makes the case that throughout history, science has tried to expand our horizons, and the church has basically tried to confine them. Right? So, direct opposites. And that science and religion have always been at war. Basically, it's always been the case. This book marks the origin of what we call the conflict thesis. Right? So that's kind of the first cell, the origin of this kind of narrative, which maintains they are incompatible. And not just that there's conflict, but actually that they are incompatible. But in recent years, there's been a lot of work done by a lot of historians of both science and historians of religion to show that this conflict thesis seriously distorts and oversimplifies the history of science. And most scientists today are working within some sort of religious framework and are far from being at war with religion. but we'll take deeper dives into that. Okay, this is actually, that's why I'm so that guy's not the United States ambassador to Russia, that is just a mistake. It's this guy. He was the diplomat. So he's a historian and a diplomat. That makes more sense. Sorry, it was a typo. In the same year, so 1874, same year, we got a second paper from this guy. His thesis, he published it in, I guess, magazine, Popular Science Monthly, and also put it in a book 2 years later in 1876. It was titled The Warfare of Science. 20 years later down the line, he published his second book, which is A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, in which he criticized the dogmatic and restrictive forms of Christianity. So basically the same thing. And his first publication was in the same year. So, and these were right after sort of, we'll go into it. White's perspective drew criticisms from James Joseph Walsh, who argued in The Popes and Science, the history of papal relations to science during the Middle Ages and down to our time. Very long title, I would have shortened that. That White's view was anti-historical. So even from the beginning, you've had historians saying, hey, that's not true. He argued that the story of the supposed opposition of the Church and popes and ecclesiastical authorities to science in any of its branches is founded entirely on mistaken notions. But we don't have to go to ancient sources. We can go to some very recent sources. So the first of these would be, on the left here, we've got The Light Ages by Seb Falk, 2020. So who is Seb Falk? Seb Falk is a British historian of science. He lectures at Cambridge and is a broadcaster with the BBC and is a historical consultant. He was named BBC's New Generation Thinker of 2016. And yeah, so he lectures in both medieval history and history of science at Cambridge. And he is a senior proctor and fellow. His first publication, The Light Ages, which is an illuminating guide to the scientific and technological achievements of the Middle Ages, was awarded Best Book of 2020 by The Telegraph, The Times, and BBC History Magazine. So, not gone and found an obscure book in the middle of nowhere, published by my second or third cousin to kind of support that's a mainstream book, kind of saying, look, there's a whole bunch of amazing cool science from the supposed Dark Ages, moving to the second book, The New Atheism, Myth and History, The Black Legends of Contemporary Anti-Religion. So that's published 2021. That's by Nathan Johnstone. He's actually an atheist himself. So kind of taking a dig at his own sort of camp, which is kind of unusual, but also any good academic should be willing to do that. So not too surprising. He is a former historian and lecturer of history and cultural studies at Portsmouth University, London University, and Canterbury Christchurch University, not to be confused with Christchurch in Canterbury, New Zealand. This is the one in England. An atheist himself, his book, which it's quite expensive. It's over $200 on Amazon, but I got it for $20. So a little trick for Amazon: if you leave books in your cart for long enough, they just suddenly go on sale. That's how I've sort of got all of my books. So you can leave 20, 30 books in your cart at once. And I don't know if it's just an Amazon thing. You'll just one day log on and have a look, and $200 book for $20. Why not? But yeah, so it examines the misuse of history in New Atheism and their militant form of anti-religion, who in their cavalier approach to history have constructed their own history, that of a perpetual and one-sided conflict between religion and science, or rationalism even, to suggest the innate superiority of the non-religious mind. In several detailed case studies, the book carefully traces how these myths have long been overturned by historians. So yes, pretty much the same line that was argued by Draper and Dickinson. Yes, but not tenable by historians. But moving to a third book, 2021, published by Oxford University Press. Also, you might have heard of that little publishing house maybe. So again, not something that I've gone searching for. This is just the literature. If you go looking, you'll find this pretty quickly. So Of Popes and Unicorns, what a title. But that's written by historian James Ongoranu, and David Hutchins co-authored it. So who's James Ongoranu? He is a historian of science and religion and honorary research fellow at the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, that's a bit of a mouthful, and also at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Queensland. So, and that is in Australia, where he received his PhD under distinguished early modern historian Peter Harrison. And this is his most recent book, co-authored with David Hutchins, who's actually a physics teacher and fellow of the Institute of Physics. So I guess physicist, physics teacher, kind of weighing in on the science stuff there as well. And it debunks many of the myths sort of perpetuated between Christianity and science, or science and religion in general. So there's some books that you can go chase. You don't have to take my word for it. Please don't take my word for it. I'm no sorry. There's more. These are just some of the other books, and I brought them all here if you want to have a look through them. So those two are the same author, Ronald L. Numbers, on the left here. That's 2010, that's 2015, that's the sequel. So who's Ronald L. Numbers? So he received his PhD in the history of sciences at the University of California, Berkeley. And the bulk of his career was spent at the University of Wisconsin as professor in history of science and in medicine, earning the George Sarton Medal, which is the History of Science Society's sort of most prestigious award you can get in history, as a lifetime of exceptional scholarly achievement by a distinguished scholar. So those two are both kind of very interesting books as well. There's quite a bit of overlap between them, even though one's a sequel, which is strange, but I guess it's an updated version. But he does call it a sequel. And then we move to the third book on the right, and that's a tome. That thing's massive. So that will take a while to get through. But basically, that's like the dictionary on this kind of stuff. So David Lindbergh is, you may have heard of him, and these look Harvard University Press, University of Sheridan Press, not sort of no names. But who is David Lindbergh? He is Professor Emeritus of History of Science and the Director of the Institute for Research in the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and General Editor of the 8-volume Cambridge History of Science. So the Cambridge sort of guide on history of science, he's the General Editor of that, with 8 volumes, and he was the former President of the History of Science Society, and was also awarded its most prestigious prize in 2001 for a lifetime of scholarly achievement, which is the George Sarton Medal. And then on the end is another one, but we've gone through enough books, I think, so we can move on. There's a lot of books, but if books aren't your thing, if reading isn't your thing, I know it takes a lot of time to get through all of this literature. So if you prefer podcasts or would like to go to a blog, I would recommend checking out Tim O'Neill. He himself is an atheist, self-confessed skeptic and rationalist, who is a subscribing member of the Atheist Foundation of Australia and former state president of the Australian Skeptics, for anyone who wants to know. And he has a bachelor's degree with honours in English and history and research, and a research-based master's from the University of Tasmania, specialising in the historical analysis of medieval literature. So that's just one that's kind of easier to peruse, a blog, if you would prefer to do that, and it's maybe a bit more accessible than all of the previous heavy academic books that we've sort of summarised. So much more accessible in blog, and it's quite funny. He uses quite a bit of rhetoric and stuff, so I do encourage that one. If you prefer podcasts, David Hutchins and James Ongoranu, the author of Hopes and Unicorns, actually have an episode on the book, so if you want to jump into that, you can probably save yourself many hours of reading a book in the 40-minute podcast, if you want to sort of get a good grasp of the sort of main issues there. If you just want to get into philosophy in general, but they will have all of the sort of major names and sort of events that are talked about. You'll find them in Partially Examined Life. They have 314 episodes, and they just basically cover like all of these things you search. They'll have an episode on it. It's 4 guys usually, sometimes 3 guys talking about it. Sort of decided to be professional philosophers and then decided against it, but also have all of that background and then some went back to it. So it's a sort of another accessible one. And then Unbelievable has 19 years and basically gets all of the sort of experts from like any field. Basically, you jump on there, you'll find a podcast on that, but it's always people with opposing views. So I'll have one of side A, one of side B. Justin's the mediator. He's always, I don't know how he does it, but he does not sort of steer the conversation towards the side we know is obviously the side that he'll support, but he's not very, very neutral in that. He'll clarify, he'll ask questions, he can make sure that it's sort of like everybody gets their sort of take on it. So I think that one's good for anyone to jump in. Right, how are we doing for the historical and cultural side? Alright, we've done historical side. I've pointed you to, if you want more, there's many more. We've kind of dealt with that, but we still have to explain it still culturally persists, right? The conflict myth is still pervasive in sort of pop culture, asking sort of high school kid, are you religious? No, why not? Oh, because of science, right? I believe in science. It's kind of the typical response you'll get. Media, movies, sort of that side of it still persists. So I guess we should try and explain that in some way. And we haven't even touched on the rhetorical philosophical side that is coming. But I mean, if we wanted to say things like we live in a post-Christian world, Christianity or religion in general, I didn't say Christianity because that's sort of, we're in the West, that's the main one. Even on a global scale, it's still kind of like the main religion. It's kind of the one where science also has had probably the most interaction. So, but we can use religion in general as well. So maybe it's just simply unfashionable, right? It's unfashionable to be religious. We were religious as a society. Now that's outdated. I don't want to be a part of that, but that's kind of a cheeky response. I don't actually think that's enough to dismiss it. The second one, people don't like changing their minds, ideas, beliefs, opinions, despite what the historical record might show. You know, who goes back and updates their sort of positions? Not many people do that. Scientists generally are pretty good at that. But in general, about history, who's reading books on history of science? I haven't come across many. And so really the loudest voices are the ones that are going to get the sort of influence on culture, which would be the new atheist movement. That was their whole goal. That was their endeavor, right? But if we consider maybe there actually is a conflict, right? So the underlying rhetoric of the historical side is there has been conflict. Okay, let's say there was no historical conflict. That doesn't mean that there isn't an underlying conflict or there isn't some more fundamental, deeper conflict present, or just because there was no history and no conflict in the past doesn't mean there's no conflict today or that there won't be in the future, you know? So I think we do have to kind of try and get to that sort of deeper kind of question there. And perhaps those religious folk in history, maybe they were brilliant scientists, but maybe they just were ignorant to these deeper issues, right? That's also another possibility. I mean, it's unlikely they're the ones that came up with the scientific method and all that, but that's fine, maybe nonetheless. So maybe they were just simply mistaken, not because of methodological problems, but because of what we now know, because of what science has taught us. So this is now the specifics. So there's two kind of problems there. Yeah. So the first is that science and religion are incompatible in principle, i.e. what they are is incompatible. The second one is, so basically you take all these brilliant scientists from the past who were religious, bring them into the modern world, but if they knew what we know now, obviously they would recant immediately, and yeah, so this is, they would agree there are major conflicts based on what we know now through scientific inquiry, and the claims, I should say claims about the world found in many different religions on offer. So that's kind of the two sort of takes I want to go with the philosophical rhetorical route. Rhetorical just means sort of what is implied. There's an implied underlying sort of not immediately present, which is what the historical conflict thesis was kind of getting at, right? There's an underlying. So our goal is to reconcile these three things: science, reason, faith. That's the terms I used in the beginning. You'll notice that religion's not there, or philosophy, but we'll get to that in a minute. But basically that's our goal, and we've got a bit of time, more time than I thought. I thought we'd get bogged down in the history a bit longer, but we didn't. Cool. Maybe if we have time at the end, we can go through some historical examples, which I didn't go through, if people are interested in that. So the two ways that we're going to try and reconcile these three things are in principle, i.e. what they are, what is faith, what is reason, what is science. And then the second way is basically, perhaps it's not what they are, but it is the contents of inside their sort of field. So specific scientific hypotheses or theories or claims versus specific religious claims, and also this whole idea of faith. What even is it? And ready? Oops. Not three things, five things. So we've got to get these other buzzwords in there. Evidence, right? Can't say evidence. You can't have faith without evidence popping up too. That's another buzzword in this whole conversation that comes up. And religion too. Religion is kind of an ambiguous term. We can get to that in a minute. But I haven't put philosophy anywhere on the board. So how do you want to reconcile that? Now I know there's probably a room full of scientists here, but wait, it's all philosophy, always has been, which I guess is a pretty bold claim, and I'm going to have to try and justify that, which we can get to. So if it's all philosophy, then what is philosophy? I hear you saying. Well, what comes to mind first? Have a moment. What is philosophy? I don't know what your background is. Any philosophers in the room? No. Anyone have much of an interest or background? Passing there, David. What about science? Anyone have a background in science or interested in science? Let's see, some hands. Yeah, quite a few. Okay, what about history? Anyone interested in history? Yeah. Religion, anyone? Yeah, whether religion or faith or... Okay, well, look, if I don't lie, if you mention philosophy to me in high school or even university, or even imagine if I ask most people I meet, they'll probably think of some old Greek dudes, some old dead Greek dudes, right? Particularly these guys, with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Unfortunately, that would be like history of philosophy. We're not doing history of philosophy, so now we're going to be doing actual philosophy. So we don't need to worry too much about these guys. I mean, I'd love to talk about these guys, and they've said some things that I will probably be using, but I'm not going to be delving into who they are and what they did, as interesting as that may be. So what do I mean by philosophy? If you jump to a dictionary or Google it, you'll get, philosophy, I know what that is. It's the love of wisdom, right? Philo, love, sophia, wisdom. I've never really been satisfied with that. Anybody can love wisdom. You don't have to be a philosopher. How is that even? How does the love of wisdom inform me anything about it? It's just the way you feel about something. So I'm not going to use that definition. But anyway, I'm really just after philosophical tools for tonight. But as any professional armchair philosopher would do, I have to define my terms. So these are the ones that I've kind of been trying to define philosophy for a while. It's kind of hard, but these are my two favorites, and there is a typo there. But the first one is, if you can argue about it, it's probably philosophy, or it is philosophy. I'll explain why that's my definition in a minute. And then the second one is the question or the prefix of what is. So that's kind of the two definitions I like to use. So why did I mention argumentation? Well, in philosophy, an argument consists of a set of statements called premises that serve as grounds for affirming another statement called the conclusion. Philosophers typically distinguish arguments in natural languages such as English into fundamentally different kinds, deductive and inductive. That's taken straight from Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And the second one was the what is definition. So the first is basically you can argue about it, and we'll go through those arguments in a minute. But the second one was what is. And the reason I like that one is because if you were to Google philosophy of mathematics, or philosophy of mind, or philosophy of religion, or philosophy of language, philosophy of psychology, philosophy of education, or philosophy of science, what those people are trying to do is say what that thing is. They're trying to say philosophy of language is, well, what is language? What is this thing? Or philosophy of mind, what is the mind? Okay, but sometimes the what is question is a very difficult question to ask, right? That's why we leave it to the philosophers who get paid to argue. That's what philosophers do, and professional ones get paid to do it. So why I think the what is question is kind of nebulous is it requires demarcating, right? Putting in boundaries, putting in rigorous sort of definitions, precise defining of your terms, making distinctions. Right? Those boundaries and definitions are good to make distinctions between things, but you have to be very precise with your language. But those distinctions can be very useful for understanding problems or conundrums, or when you're comparing things, it's very handy. But it gets messy very quickly and it's quite slow. So I think there's a lot more fruitful questions in the short term, such as asking what does something do, instead of asking what it is, just ask what does it do. Okay, well let's observe it and write down what it does. Or even better, how does it behave? So the how question, I think you get to an answer pretty quickly, and this is kind of, or even if you want to say not what it is, you can say, well, what does it appear to be? What does it look like? A lot easier to answer than what it is. And if you want to get very specific, if I were to ask the audience, what is an electron? We might be here for a while. If I say, what does an electron do? Well, we could get there pretty quick. Or even better, how does an electron behave? So the real difference I'm getting here is the difference between, you can run it with light as well. What is light? It's a very hard question to answer. Is it a particle? Is it a wave? But how does light behave? Well, here are some different things I can say about how it behaves. I can talk a lot about how it behaves. What it is, what is energy? Again, how does energy behave? Much more clear question with sort of ways to approach it. The what is question is ambiguous as to how do you get there, which is the perspective. The how is, okay, well let's observe, take notes. Same for mass, time, etc., all the things we love to use in science. But especially when you get to something that's a primitive, or a primitive would be like a starting assumption and an auxiliary assumption, something you use to explain something else, but you can't really explain. It is what you use to explain other things, then trying to explain that, well, like time, right? Space and time. What are these things? Well, this space is where things happen. Now, trying to explain space in those terms is kind of hard. Time, again. So what is just not so great when you're dealing with something more fundamental. When you get to something more fundamental, more primitive, more foundational, the what is gets very hard because you've got less things at your disposal. So that's kind of the way I use to kind of separate my philosophical and my scientific questions. We haven't even touched on the why question, which the why question, the problem with the why question is it just begs the question again, why? Right? If you've got little toddlers, which I do, you can just add another why, add infinitum, and we'll never get to the bottom, right? Because you can ask another why, and that's where an explanation, but that's sort of like an explanation, right? The why explanation is sometimes what we want. Science is great giving us hows, philosophy might be able to give us a what. The why question, I don't know, that's kind of a tricky one, and I think that's more where narrative comes in, myth comes in, explanation. The why explanation is kind of, you need a story out, and the epistemology is kind of like the how. How do we know that? So, several questions I would say. It's like, what do you know, and how did you come to that conclusion? But there's many ways you can cut up the branches of philosophy. I just think there's basically three. Axiology, which is theories of value, which is sort of, we'll go through aesthetics, ethics, politics, right? That kind of side of philosophy where we're making judgments, oughts, doing prescriptives. You should, this is good, this is beautiful, you should find this beautiful, taste my coffee. You ought to find my coffee tasteful, right? All that kind of stuff, especially with ethics, right? You should behave this way, it's right, it's wrong, moral value, just, evil, good, bad, and then politics, how do we govern, what sort of policies, do we have the authority to tell people how to behave? All very prescriptive, some descriptions too, but if we move to the other two, you'll kind of leave some of that prescriptive behavior, language behind, and we'll move to more descriptive. So epistemology, yes, so theories of knowledge. And there's different ways we can know things. A priori, so that would be prior to experience, and a posteriori, which just means post-experience. So what can you know about something before you go and experience it? What can you know after? Turns out these questions end up in different things that you can say about it. For example, if we were to say to the question, or the statement rather, everything in the universe is either a potato or it isn't, all right? If we want to know that sort of empirically, so through science, through experience, we would have to go check everything in the whole universe. It's going to take a bit of time. If we want to know that prior, well, we already know that through the laws of logic, of non-contradiction and excluding it. When we find something, at the end of the day, it's either going to be a potato or it is not going to be a potato. Whatever the category is, I don't know what the category is. It can't both be and not be. Right? That would be a contradiction. Right? It cannot both be and not be, and there's also no space for it to be anything else. It's either got to be or it's not going to be. There's no third option there. We'll get to these actual sort of rules in a minute, but this is just kind of giving you a feel. And then theories of truth, right? So if we're going to be talking about science and religion and faith and all that, we need to know what we mean when we use the word truth. Now, there's basically three ways we can split that. Correspondence, so when I say something, it corresponds to something else. My claim corresponds to something. When I say there's a chair there, there actually is a chair there. So there's some real component. We've got two sides. Perhaps truth is a it's a sum, A and B. You need two things to correspond together before you can get it. And what I like to think about is a question and answer. Correspond. That's how you can get your truth. The other idea is coherence, right? This is, do things cohere? Do they stick together, or are they oil and water, right? So coherence would be more your analytical truth, so maths, the logic, the truth between things. Do these things say things that sort of conflict each other? So coherence. Am I saying one thing and then the next minute backpedaling and saying the other thing? Okay, so then it can't be true because it does not cohere. And then the third one is pragmatic. Well, it's true because I get the result that I want. Right? It works. It's true that if you step outside in the rain, you're going to get wet. That's what we're saying. Pragmatic is, okay, you can have a false explanation as to why something works. Okay, my car engine works because there's tiny unicorns in there running around turning the motor. Okay, my explanation is not true, but if I'm building the motor and it works, right? It's pragmatic. Practical truth. We can guess. There's a little more into that later. I didn't have a good example of that one. And then methods of justification, because it turns out you can't really know anything other than maybe Descartes sort of thing. We'll skip that because some people don't like that, but I think it's quite valid actually. But yeah, so when we're talking about knowledge, well, if I want to share my knowledge with you, you're just going to ask me, well, how do you know that? And then I have to tell you how, I have to demonstrate, I have to justify that knowledge, right? But I could be wrong, so it's actually just justified true belief, because if my friend said, if we go watch, I don't know, the footy, and then his team wins and he says, I knew they were going to win, I would say, well, you didn't know. You just really, really thought that they were going to win, and you also wanted them to win. Right? It wasn't knowable yet. You couldn't have known that. So there's basically two primary ways. Well, the ways I'm going to use it to justify, which would be through reasoning, right? We provide reasons why we have these beliefs. So first, they must be true. We have to pick a theory of truth. Then we have to pick a method of justification. But the last part, just the JTB, justified true belief. The belief part means you just actually have to believe it. Right? You have to intellectually assent to this idea. If you don't, well, you're just lying. That's a lie. You're lying to yourself. But the two main reasons are deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. One goes from, so deductive is kind of from general to specific. If I already know these things, what are some other things I know, right? It's not sort of giving you some new knowledge, it's just already within my definitions and principles, this is what I know. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man. This third statement that I'm about to say, Socrates is mortal, we already knew that in the first two. Okay, it's already hiding in there. That is true by definition. I don't have to take that on sort of a confidence interval. That follows necessarily based on rules of inference, laws of logic, deductive reasoning, analytical, mathematical. It's where we get our proofs. That's my favorite kind of, I'm a rationalist, so that's my favorite kind of reasoning. Inductive, now inductive is a little bit more tricky. It's going from the specific to the general. It's going, okay, I've got all these little things, these little experiences, okay, I'm going to line them all up and try and figure out what's the general rule here, okay? But I don't have the general rule ready, it's not there, I've got to infer it, right? It's might be implied, but I've got to do the work of inferring it, right? So this is inference to the best explanation. This is the major sort of reasoning of science, right? Synthetic, it's going beyond, it's looking out, it's going to the general, what are these general principles, versus deductive is, okay, give me some general principles and I'll tell you some other cool things. All right, so, and you can use both, you don't have to use one or the other. Obviously, scientists use a lot of mathematics, which is a lot of deductive reasoning. Then we go to metaphysics, right? So that's a tricky one. We're probably not going to do much on metaphysics tonight, as much as I'd love to, but that's basically study of existence, being, reality, like, am I real? We won't get to that stuff. But, I mean, that's a large part of philosophy is asking these questions, right? What does exist? What can exist? Are those different questions? It seems like it, right? It seems like there's more things that could exist than what actually does. Somebody could have made this shirt with red stripes instead of blue, but that's sort of contingent, I guess, necessary. Is reality all that exists? I mean, it seems like a valid sentence, but how do you check? Does the past exist or the future? So very sort of deep what is questions there. But then a more sort of practical side of metaphysics would be the types of existence. So actually exists, it potentially exists, abstract, representational, so maths, language, sort of moving up the layers here. Quantitative versus qualitative, that's a pretty good distinction that I find handy. Anyone know the wavelengths of red and blue? Is that from memory, or can you derive them based on the blueness and the redness? Can you get the quantity from the quality, and vice versa? If I were to say a number, well, that must be red because that can't be blue, that number. Seems like these are different things, qualities and quantities. Yeah, that distinction, that's a tricky one. So, form versus essence versus substance. I think that's a pretty good one because you basically take form, which is I'm going to say like geometry, structure, this is where we get quantitative relations, mathematics. Essence, now we get all of our colors, cool. Blue and red. But talking about these things together, we get a substance. Now I have a blue ball or a red ball or a red square or a blue square. If you talk about them without each other, say the number 7, where is the number 7? What is the mass of number 7? Where are all the numbers? How big are the numbers? What is the spin of the numbers? You sort of can't ask those sort of qualitative sort of questions, even though they're quantitative, we get them for our senses. But the same is if I just say red, how big is red? How many reds are there? Again, they're different things, but together you get a substance, right? So that's sort of maybe a substance emerges when you combine these two things. And we're basically always kind of dealing with substances, never an essence in its pure form, but we're getting distracted. So things versus the relation between them, so the objects versus, I guess, the rules of how they're related. That's another version of physics. Discrete versus continuous. So that's kind of trying to reconcile things that are made up of little bits and something that's like, it's just a wave, man. It's everywhere all the time. So that's another tricky one. Or subject versus object, subjective versus objective. That's one that actually comes up in this debate a lot, the conflict thesis, right? Science, objective, everything else, subjective. Okay, but I subjectively know I like coffee, and that's probably one of the most certain things I know. It's a subjective preference. Do I know objective things more than that? I kind of infer that there's objects beyond my senses, but I certainly know my own subjective things with much more certainty, but we're getting distracted. Okay, so here's the two big ones. The empiricists and the rationalists. So if you go through history of science and philosophy, these are the guys you're going to get, because philosophers and scientists were the same people back in the day. So here you'll have those guys, and basically this is like, are you team red or team blue? Well, I've got green and red there. Are you team green or are you team red? Empiricists, they're like the sensory stuff there. Sense knowledge is primarily derived from our sense experience. Okay, so the red guys are like, no, this is our knowledge is derived from these formal rules, right? These laws of logic that we can't break, right? That's how we can know things. That's how we prove things, right? That's how we justify it. Analytical truths, laws of logic, the sport of exact thinking. And the empiricists go, well, that doesn't actually explain any of our sense experience, right? So if I'm going to do an inference to the best explanation, and you're not getting to any of my sensory experiences, what am I explaining here? So I think we're going to use both. Right? I think it's quite obvious. We have to use both. There's my example of pragmatic. It would be, don't worry about what these variables are when you go study quantum physics. I mean, you can, but they might just say, don't worry about them, just calculate it, get the answer, because that's what we want, right? Just build this computer. You don't need to know what numbers are, just need to know how they work. And we get the result we want. So that's an example of pragmatic truth. Coherence, we'll use the 3 laws of thought and correspondence. But, see, now faith. How does faith fit into all of these philosophical things I just talked about? When does faith come into it and science? So in terms of empiricism, rationalism, deductive, inductive, where do we put little faith? Or does it not belong anywhere, right? I mean, is this just for the superstitious? Is it just for the unscientific, the wishful thinkers, the religious? What is this faith thing? Well, if we look at the Latin, and we always have to look at the Latin already of our words, but no, it's confidence is confide, which is with faith, sorry. And if you've ever done any sort of science, you've always got to put your confidence intervals in there. You've got to show your uncertainty, right? So, and what is confidence? Well, whenever there's uncertainty, I'm just going to say whenever there's uncertainty, faith follows. Because what you're basically saying is, I'm not certain. I could be wrong. But I'm confident I'm going to act in a certain way anyway. I trust that this is this result, right? So the more confident you are, the more faith you have that that's the answer, right? The more confident you are with an answer or a solution or a problem, I would think naturally your faith in terms of following and acting on that would scale. So if I heard the fire alarm, my confidence that there's a fire would be higher, and so I'm going to act on that, right? I'm going to be faithful to that. If I saw fire, my confidence level would be higher, so my faith that there is a fire would be raised, right? So confidence and faith work together, and I don't think, unless you want to say that there's no uncertainty at all in sort of your knowledge claims, then you can do it with faith, but I don't think that's a claim made by sort of anyone in science or philosophy. There's always uncertainty. So in my philosophical toolkit for tonight, we're going to look at the 3 fundamental laws of logic, or the 3 laws of thought, as I like to call them. And there's another little typo there, sorry, the slides. I ran out of slides basically that capped me on the platform I was using. I didn't know that I was on the free version, so I moved to paper at some point. I never went back, but yeah. So our first law of logic is the law of non-contradiction. Second will be the law of excluded middle, the law of identity. Now I don't remember learning this at school at all, but maybe you guys do. Anyone remember these from school? Uni? They sort of undergird all of our language and all of our math and all of our computers, and they're just sitting there in the background. I think it's worthwhile understanding them. So the first one is the law of non-contradiction, which is every proposition is either true or false. Okay? So when you have sort of a contradictory statement, it can't be both true and false. It can't. If you have sort of the statement, it is a potato and it is not a potato. That's a contradiction in terms. They can't both be true, sort of both be false. So if you do get to those contradictory, mutually exclusive claims, we know that one of them has to be true. Okay. If they contradict each other, they can't both be false. They obviously can't both be true, but they also can't both be false. I guess it's also the law of, I think it's double negation. If it's false, that it's false, it's true. These make more sense when we have examples. But basically, the second law is the law of the excluded middle. Not only does it have to either be true or false, it can't be true and false at the same time. Because that's a contradiction in terms. And so the excluded middle, see how there's space in the middle? You might say, well, it's not quite true, it's not quite false, it's like somewhere in the middle. There's this space between. Why are you being so binary? It's not so black and white. The law of excluded middle says, no, it's that. This is it. You get closer to true from false. Well, if you cross that boundary, you're in true land. There's nowhere else you can't. It's true or false. There's no way between true or false, right? For every proposition. Okay. And the law of identity, which you might think this is self-evident, but it's actually quite useful, is each thing is identical with itself. So you can't say that it's similar to, or they're alike, or it was produced by, or it's related to, or created from, or emergent, or correlates. It is. Right? It's equal, it's identical. That's if you're making an identical claim relation. So the law of identity can be useful for teasing apart sort of nuances there. And then so after we have those 3 rules, well, we're going to use a deductive argument, or what's one of the more popular ones is the syllogism, where we start with a major premise, which is sort of the general statement, we move to a minor premise, a little bit more specific, and then we get a conclusion. Right? So that was the all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And that just follows logically. Okay? So that is a syllogism. Now I think we're going to leave all of that logic stuff away and move to science for a brief moment. So everybody take a breath. Breathe again. Science. What is science? Remember a little definition of philosophy of the what is? Well, that question is actually what philosophers of science do. And if you have a look at that, well, there's lots of different arguments going around as to what science is. So you get the anti-realist, the realist, the structural realism, constructivism, empiricism, relativism, but we don't need to worry about all that tonight, okay? No, we don't. Because I have my own definitions I prepared earlier, like any good armchair philosopher. So the first one, well, and that's not really everyone, that's a kind of a cheeky one. Fundamentally, science is a human behavior. I can't think of any other animals that do science. So, I mean, while that's probably the true definition, doesn't really tell us much about it. Other than, I think it's true science is a behavior, it's something you do, which is quite different from philosophy, which is just, I don't know, maybe something you think about or say. Science, you have to go out and do it. You have to go explore the globe, you've got to go get your machete, you've got to go through the jungles, you've got to go out into space, you've got to actually do something, right? It's a behavior, right? And this kind of separates the doers from the thinkers. But the second definition is a bit more precise. It's coming together, or I guess an application, right? You're applying it, doing it with both rationalist and empiricist methods or philosophies. I guess the goal is you're collecting data, right? Evidence. Collecting, you're categorizing, you're codifying. So you're attaching the labels to this bit of data, the labels here, turning into a code, an algorithm, something that you can use. And it's all based on our sense data, which, I mean, there's a lot of sense data available at all times. We won't go into information theory, but there's a lot there. But basically, it's always through mediation of the senses and then ultimately through the mind, right? If you weren't aware of those sensory experiences with your mind, well, if a tree falls in a forest and nobody's there to hear it, did it fall? So these are all mediated through the mind. That's an important point. And basically, well, the pragmatic hopes of science would be in the hopes of uncovering or revealing. You sort of have that correspondence theory, right? We're actually finding out real truths here about the world in science, or at the very least, effectively modeling the dynamical behavior of the world around us. Well, why are we able to start there by effectively? Basically, what makes an effective model is it produces a usable prediction, which allows you to manipulate or impart change, directable change and influence, you can make things, build things, and as long as you have a model that sort of gives you predictions that can do that, well, science is working. You don't need to even claim that it's uncovering this real truth, which is why you have all these people arguing, right? There's different views on this, depending on your theory of truth. So clearly philosophy matters to science there, but if you want to be pragmatic, that's fine. I like that. And then the mind as well that's just consciousness and meta-consciousness. But I think it's worthwhile making the distinction because consciousness you can just have base consciousness, right? Of I guess how we might think of a rudimentary biological thing or living organism, right? It just has the experience. Meta-consciousness is it has the experience of the experience, right? It's now aware that it's having experiences. It has now the ability to reflect and now look at the relations between things, not just at the thing, not just, I guess, if you didn't have meta-consciousness, it would just be, if you were just looking at things, you'd just be like blue, 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 red, red, red. You wouldn't be able to go, oh, I was looking at blue, now I'm looking at red, now this is changed. So it's sort of like that extension in time or extension in general. So that's the difference between meta-consciousness, consciousness, and I think it's quite clear that meta-consciousness is where you get the sort of relations between things, the analytical truths, the maths, the rationalists, and then the empiricist is sort of just the raw-based consciousness, that sensory experience, but you kind of need to add them together to do science. You need both. It's not one or the other. Now, the idea of scientific progress, that's another huge topic in this area. How does scientific progress? Look, I didn't even ask have we progressed. I think it's just quite clear that there's been a heck of a lot of scientific progress in the centuries. But how does that happen? Is it little tiny consecutive graduated tiny little steps? I think that's how probably most people would think about it, right? We gain this little bit of knowledge, we add it on, we gain this little bit of scientific, we add it on, add it on, add it on, and now we have this big corpus. And, or is it giant leaps and bounds, we know this much, and then suddenly, boom, this much, and then boom, another big step. And depending on which one you pick, well, what do you attribute it to? What is happening there? Why are you having a gigantic leap and bound? Or if you're not having that, why is it only these tiny little steps? That's kind of what philosophers of science have been doing more recently, rather than talking about the foundations. It's more about the progress, right? So, and Thomas Kuhn is one that a name that will come up if you look into this at all. He sort of had a view of a paradigmatic nature of science, which has a normal science and a revolutionary science. So most of science, the bulk of science is normal science. You're operating within a paradigm, so a Newtonian paradigm, right? With a set of assumptions and theories. What counts as evidence will depend on the paradigm you're in. What counts as that'll define what an anomaly is. So how do you actually then go to another paradigm? Well, it's through a revolution, scientific revolution, right? So we went to the Einsteinian revolution, but how did we get? That was a giant step, right? That this is a completely different understanding of basically everything in space and time. We only had straight lines, now we've got curves everywhere. How did we miss all of these curves before in our normal science? Well, it's not that you were missing them, it's just you were in a different paradigm. And so it's really, if you track the progress of science, I would say, and Thomas Kuhn says, it happens more in these giant leaps and bounds. It's where the progress happens. But obviously there's normal science happening all the time, and you're understanding, filling out that paradigm more, getting more and more data, sort of. But what you really want to do is you want to look everywhere in that paradigm, push it to the boundaries where your theories and hypotheses start breaking down, because that's when you get close to this revolution again, right? That's where there is scope. When you have these anomalies start building up, you go, okay, well, now we're getting somewhere. So you kind of want to go find the limits of your theories and paradigm, which is kind of what we're doing with general relativity, quantum field theory, all that kind of stuff. How do we make this work? Quantum gravity, standard model. But obviously before you do the shift, it's very hard. Second sort of textbook on progress of science would be Paul Feyerabend, sort of a different take, but basically it's talking about things like how does the aesthetic criteria and our preferences and our personal convictions, obviously different people have different views of science, as I showed on the map before, how does that play a role? What about social dynamics, political dynamics, power, authority? Do these play a role? And if so, are they trivial? Are they non-trivial? He thinks they play non-trivial roles in the history and progress of science. So, in the conflict thesis, I would definitely think we would have to kind of take those concerns on board and engage with them, which I have done. Now we're moving to the third thing. We haven't reconciled these things yet. We're just trying to define them. So religion, what is it? What it is. Sorry, this is kind of about when I found out that I was going to be limited on my slides. Alright, so what it is it's an unhelpful term. Okay, it's just loaded with ambiguity. You hear things like, well, let's just go through. So it's not well defined, and then you tend to do so. You end up say those are religions, or it's so ambiguous you've just got everything in there, like chess is now a religion. Okay. Or my favorite movies. I have a set of beliefs about my favorite movies. Is that a religion? It's a set of beliefs. Okay. So I think it's an unhelpful term. It's kind of hard to rigorously define. Also, if you want to compare it to things like science and philosophy, well, there's no common epistemology. There's no common way to say this is how we know things to all of the religions. There's no common metaphysics, ontology to all religions of them saying, well, this is what exists. So you can't really say things like, is religion true or is religion false? Or even saying things like, I like religion, I don't like religion. Well, it kind of depends, right? Because there's going to be opposite claims in there. So I don't think we should use that term religion as a whole in any real sort of rigorous, meaningful way. It's cool as like a nice little category, but we can't really investigate that term too much. What we really have to do is compare the parts, right? Instead of comparing as a whole, we have to investigate individual itty little parts, right? So, but this is fun for philosophers and scientists, breaking things down into the individual parts. You know, how do these things go together? And then moving to, with the preponderance of mutually exclusive and contradicting claims, is the clincher. We know that they cannot all be true. So even saying all of religion is true is just incoherent, because they make mutually exclusive claims, which we know from the laws of logic cannot be true. But at the same time, what else does that mean? It means we can't say all of them are false. And I think that's something that most people forget. They go, it can't all be true, but guess what? It can't also all be false, which means there are lots of religious claims that are necessarily true, because there's also religious claims saying the opposite. And they can't both be false if they are mutually exclusive. So this really means, yes, if you do want to take it seriously, you're forced to go through and look at the individual components, right? Which is a lot of work. It's easier to dismiss it all at once, but that doesn't make any sense. That's incoherent, okay? I basically just demonstrated that. This is my point about comparing wholes and parts. So yeah, this is like kind of come up with a rule for the whole. What is a religion? Well, can't really do that. We went through that. The general rule versus the specific, or the universal versus the particular, the rule versus an example of the rule, macro versus micro, all those kinds of things, Mereology. But basically, yeah, that was one of that. Okay, so this is when I got to 50 slides, and it was like, okay, you can't make any more slides, so now I'm going to go off script and reconcile these. But how are we going for time? Oh, we're about an hour. Okay. So do these things overlap? Well, I would certainly say if you're going to be making arguments in science, empirical arguments, right, inductive arguments, inference to the best explanation, well, that's a philosophical tool. So naturally, these things are, there's a...
Take it back to Andrew.
Naturally, so these things are using, there's a common point there, right? Reasoning and arguing. Scientists and philosophers both do that. So I think science and philosophy, yep, these are similar things, except the major way that they're different is that mathematical truths or logical proofs, I would say, it's kind of like out of bounds for science, right? Because you can't scientifically investigate that. It just doesn't make sense. Those true, we take in science, you take mathematical truths to be true. You just say, I'm going to use these tools, which is why Einstein, people say he wasn't great at maths. No, he was very, very good at maths, but he still needed to approach mathematicians. So these aren't scientists, they're just pure philosophy, pure deductive, analytical reasoning to develop tools to aid him in his theories, his hypothesis, right? Now, why are we applying these analytical mathematical rules to the physical world? Well, that's a great question. What is the relationship between maths and the physical world? Well, that's a great one, but not in the scope of tonight's discussion. But I think that is something worth noting, but that wouldn't be a sort of scientific investigation. That would be a philosophical. Now, another thing about science being human behavior is humans and all living things make things. We create things, we produce things. I mean, a lot of it's waste. We make waste products, but a lot of it's not waste. Sometimes it can be technology, or sometimes it can be evidence. Right? So a product of science, you have science, the sort of method, the behavior, right? Or even the institution, which is what Feyerabend was talking about. Science is an institution, but science, in terms of the evidence it produces, we can take all that evidence, okay, so put it on the table, let's bring all the evidence to the table. Now, what do we do with this evidence? There's a distinction to be made between evidence and explanation. A lot of the times in this conflict stuff, or in the new atheist kind of discussions, they'll use the word evidence when they mean explanation and vice versa. Now, they're not the same thing at all. Evidence and an explanation are indeed very different. We use evidence and then we infer an explanation, right? We infer, and what makes one explanation better than another? Well, that's a great question. One that philosophers of science spend a lot of time on, and even scientists themselves all the time, right? Comparing hypotheses. Now, if Occam's razor comes to mind, parsimony, right? So if you have an amount of evidence on the table, here's our data. We don't have an explanation yet, but we want to explain this data. How is it that we have all this data? What's a good explanation? Now, let's say we have competing explanations, and explanation A covers 70% of the data, and explanation B covers 70% of the data. Okay, they've got the same explanatory scope, power. They both cover the same amount of data. Okay, so we can't pick and choose between how much they can explain. Okay, but explanation A has 4 assumptions. We've got to assume these other things that aren't on the table that we need. Option B has 487 things that we need to assume. Okay, well, one's obviously more simple. Okay, now do we have some reason to think that the simple one is true? No, but we have no reason to go and assume all these other 487 things if we don't have to. If that gave us 98% coverage, that's something that we'd have to entertain, right? So Occam's razor isn't the simplest explanation, the best explanation. It's if you have all other things being equal, you probably want to side with simplicity because there's no good reasons to multiply your causal explanations or assumptions beyond necessity, right? If I go ride my bike and I fall over and I hit my head and I'm wearing a helmet actually, so I'm not bleeding, and somebody asks, I mention it the next day I fell off my bike and they go, oh, and I hit my head and they say, well, is it bad? And I go, no, my head's super strong, I can't get hurt. And I was wearing a helmet. I don't need the other part about my head being super strong. The helmet is right? It's sufficient to explain why I didn't hurt my head. I don't need to, or I could say my guardian angel was looking out for me and I was wearing a helmet also. That's multiplying, so that's not very parsimonious. So this idea of parsimoniousness is an aesthetic preference, and that's kind of how we choose between competing hypotheses in science, which, look, I love physics, I didn't think it was an aesthetic preference is how it is. It's not the only way, obviously, there's predictions and testability, but all else being equal, parsimony, law of parsimony, Occam's razor. So I think that's important to evidence, but basically when we're looking at evidence, there's inference to the best explanation, that's one consideration. Right? How simple is our explanation? How much coverage of the data are we getting? That's reasoning. Now, what are we doing with this reasoning and this explanation of this data? Well, we're building a view of what this says about the world. We're building a worldview. Quite literally, science with evidence plus reasoning. The two purples are, I guess, philosophy. The two greens are kind of like, I'm going to say, science, even though they're intermingling, but this is how they fit together. And in the end, well, at the end of it, you get something like a worldview, or you can say religion, but I think worldview, or you can even call it philosophy. Some people call it philosophy. And whatever that is, I think it's not, whatever this view, to say that that is incompatible with all of these things, well, it depends on the view that you've got. Is your view compatible? You have to go through and look at the specifics of the view. Now, that was the second question. So basically this was dealing with the first part of, are these things, science and religion and philosophy and faith, incompatible in principle? And maybe that wasn't very clear, I'll have to fix it up, but basically no, they're not incompatible in any sort of logical way in what they are in their foundations. So there's one last place that the conflict could be hiding, and that's in the specific of each. So this is where we would go through things like, okay, what are some religious claims? What are some scientific things? Which, how we go for time? We can do it either in a Q&A, and I can respond to those, or I can try, or I can give an example. What do we have time for? What do we feel?
Up to everyone, but I imagine it's probably good to have some questions.
Thank you all for listening to that. Bit of all over the place.
Thank you. Any questions?
Well, I think that's where the conflict is finding is in specific religious claims. So if I'm not incorrect, a new atheist might say, well, religion had a lot of explanatory power, but now science has more explanatory power. So a religious claim might be that God caused the earthquake.
Okay, so but that's a conflict in explanation, right? Because you said religion had explanatory power, and now science, but religion isn't an epistemology. It's not. Religion isn't how we know things.
Right.
It's a set of claims. So you'd have to take that claim, that specific claim, and then compare it not. Whereas, I agree, yeah, that is where it lies, in the specifics, but a lot of the conflict thesis is in the general. But yeah, specifics, for sure. An example, yeah. Did you have a specific example?
Yeah, well, I mean, one religious claim might be that God made the world, out of nothing in 7 literal days.
Yeah, and one religious claim might be God didn't make the world in 7 days.
Yeah.
And so one of those religious claims is true, necessarily, and one is false. So we know we know one of them is true. Okay, so your problem isn't now with religion per se; it's with that specific claim, whichever one is the false claim.
Yeah.
And so, if you see what I'm saying, so really, it has to be with a specific religion, and within that religion has to be a specific claim.
Yes.
Yeah, if that makes sense at all.
Thank you, Christiaan. That was really interesting. I think one of the challenges I find is when sort of worldviews that are sort of loosely folded into the idea of science, like humanism or atheism, are sort of used. Science is used as a front for a particular worldview, and
They lay claim to something, yes.
yeah. So I think a lot of people would say science is separate from a worldview and a religion, and the idea that you can just get rid of that piece and still have a cohesive, jigsaw puzzle. And I think one of the challenges is realizing that people who claim to have only science as their world, or as the only thing that matters, really actually have so many more value statements and so many other philosophies surrounding their worldview. So how do you disentangle, science as a behaviour, as a practice, and then when people, try and use it to obscure their particular
Well, that's one. Yeah, humanism or secular humanism. Because humanism, if you search that, it's some Italian Christian guy wanting to go back to the foundation of gospel. Was the first sort of father of humanism. I forget his name, but yeah, secular humanism would have a whole lot of claims laden with prescriptive language, right? An ought, right? And the thing is, in science, at the end of the day, we've got the evidence was there, the green piece, and then we might even have a theory, right? That's sort of the holy grail of science. That's the main event, so to speak, would be your scientific theory. But that is a whole lot of descriptions of the way things are. Now, the is-ought dilemma, or the fact-value distinction, is one that I've never come across a solution. I don't think any other philosopher has, or scientist, or any human being can. You can't go from a statement about the way things are to the way things ought to be or should be. And I'll give an example. You might say something like, so science can tell us, because of science we're observing the way things are, right? Science might say something like, or I could use science, I guess, to figure out a way to inflict the most amount of harm on somebody. You figure out how to do that. But should I do it? How do I find that out from science? Where do I find the answer? You should do it or you shouldn't do it. Which particle is going to tell me that? It's not, because my theory is explaining how this came to be that way, and then it doesn't. Well, we don't have a theory of consciousness, so it's not really explaining how I could observe it, really, but pretty close. I don't know, to the neuron level we get close, but then I don't know. But anyway, basically we're getting to the way it is, and so all of that prescriptive ought language of secular humanism, right? That ethical meta-ethics. They just need to realize that none of that is coming from their science. Okay. Sam Harris tries to get objective morals from science. He gets a lot of criticism from basically all of his peers, because it's just, you can't, that dilemma of is ought. The ought, you just have to kind of smuggle in some, because you're basically saying it is this way, but it needs to be that way. But science is really only a tool to say the way that it is how I would do away with that particular kind of. So then this doesn't mean we do away with prescriptions and oughts. It means we enter that discussion and we start talking about those. But that's a study. That's one of the three pillars of philosophy: ethics. Right? That's ethics. That's axiology, value theory. So go and engage in that. I think it's valid. It's just you can't use science per se. Science can't give you the ought, but it can help you. If you're choosing between oughts, science can give you some details. If you already have the ought and you just want to know the best way to get to that ought, science can help with that. Okay, but it can't give you the ought. You give the ought. We are the sort of agents there. Questions?
So just to continue from that question, is there a way in which philosophy can find an answer to the ought? Or is that
To
just
the
coming
ought?
from revelation, like scripture, whatever?
I didn't talk about Revelation. I did say I was. So Revelation, I guess if you were to think about epistemology, how you know things religiously, I think Revelation is the first one that comes to mind, and maybe only the only one that comes to mind. I can't think of anything else. But Revelation is a strange one, because what do we really mean? what do we really mean when we say revelation? So something was revealed to somebody, right? Usually we mean God or some other supernatural being, or this information. My friend says he knew this sports team was going to win. I say, how do you know? He says, it was revealed to me last night, right? I had a revelation. It just came to me. Well, okay, so you might say, well, that's not a valid form of knowledge, right? How do you justify that? But it was true. He believed it. It was true. But how does he justify it? Well, that's tricky. I don't know how he would. But at the same time, I would then ask Einstein, how did your ideas come to you? How did you get your idea of general relativity? It just came to me. But then you test it, obviously. But all of our ideas, everyone's ideas, where do they come from? They just come to us, right? We can choose what to do with them. Right? But how do these ideas come to you? Well, they're just revealed to us. So I think there's like either no revelation or like it's all revelation. I don't really know. It would depend on your theory of consciousness. You'd have to be able to explain how do non-revealed ideas come to you. I guess you would need that to really talk about revelation. And so an ought, like anything else, I guess it's just revealed to us. But then we have to try and argue and justify it around it. It's the arguing and justifying that comes later. So in terms of oughts, well, prescriptive, something like you must drink coffee, well, that's not a very sort of controversial like sort of claim, but things like you ought to behave in a way, I guess, that is like ethical, moral, and then you would have sort of foundational things from there, like it's not ethical to do this, it's not ethical to do this, but you must be ethical, right? You must be good, you must. And so I would say you really have to, at some point, any sort of this is all axiology, this is all value theory. And this is how it usually goes. So generally, when you're dealing with prescriptive language and principles and oughtness, you might not directly make reference to a value, but indirectly, when you say you ought to do this, you are implying it would be good to do that. If you didn't do that, it would not be good, right? It's valuable, right? We value the good. We value the ought. That's basically always there. It's always present. And this is true for if you were to respond to so there's like moral relativism, right? Or subjectivism. There's no objective moral duties and values and oughts. It's all subjective, relative. But then you ask them, okay, well, why should we, why is murder bad? And they go, well, because it's better if we're thriving and flourishing. And so they've already brought the good. They've already brought that in there, into their ought. It's very hard to have an ought. Like, you must do this. Why? I have no reason. You just must. And so it really does depend on value theory. And I don't think there's a way to get moral value from, look, you're welcome to try, but I think it's very hard to get moral value from spin, states, mass, momentum, charge. I haven't seen any sort of way to do that. That's physical terms, right? In physical terms, that's, I guess, what Sam Harris would have to do if he thinks the world is ultimately made out of material. Where do we get? When does the value come in? How many protons and neutrons and electrons do you need? How many excitations of the electron field need to be happening simultaneously with the Higgs boson to get your value? Well, you could come up with an answer, but I'd say, how do you know that? Why is that really? It just seems like an impossible task to go from is to ought. If that was still the question.
Can you go back a slide?
Yeah, to which one?
I just wanted to have a comment about your definition of science, which, we're doing philosophy, so I have to disagree.
Yeah.
This
is what I want. Disagreement. This means there's opportunity.
Yeah, so, the idea that it's a behaviour is sort of interesting, but
Yeah, that was a tongue in cheek.
what I thought was quite interesting is that you don't have any.
I have lots of definitions, but
Yeah, like epistemology, like the way in which we know about the physical world, and by choosing the object of the realm in which we can ask questions or determine truth claims about the physical world, they're just simpler things to do. It's much simpler to probe and study those things. So I was just wondering why you didn't choose to put any idea of, you've got uncovering, revealing, which is quite, truth-laden language.
Yes.
I was just wondering why you didn't add any epistemology in there.
What do you mean?
About how we know, science as a way of finding truth about the physical world.
Empiricism and rationalism. Those two epistemologies together.
All right. Okay. So those two.
Yes, combined. So empiricism, all your favourite science, inductive experiments, sense data, collecting sense data.
And
then rationalism would be, now we construct a quantitative model, right? We assume that maths has some real sort of causal sort of influence somewhere in the world to even use math, right? If you're going to be using math, because your sense data is going to be qualitative. Look, science, at the end of the day, it's about observations, right? You've got to get the observations in there at some point.
I can see how you've got the sort of, it's quite instrumental in the beginning, and I'm just wondering, like, with that second bit, in the hopes of uncovering, revealing.
Yeah, I've added all three.
Truth about the physical, that would be my sort of, as opposed to just creating some model, because if it's just if it's just some model, it could
you want
be
scientific realism?
Yeah, probably more of a realist.
Yeah, how do we justify that?
Yeah.
That's a real tough one, man. I would say, look, basically, I don't think, obviously you can't justify it scientifically because you can't use the tool to justify the tool. But what you can say is something like, so the Higgs boson is a good one for this. So Peter Higgs, in a room, pencil, can prove mathematically this coherent, nice bit of math, right, about this particle. That doesn't say anything. He's not gone searching for this thing out in the world. He couldn't have experienced it with his senses. He's got to the truthness of that proof using his rational faculties, right? He's using analytical truths, these abstract, non-physical, if you're a Platonist for maths, I don't know what you want to say, it doesn't really matter. Basically, not through experience, but through deduction. But then, 50 years later, what do we get? We get some sense data, which kind of corresponds. Now I think we've got two, maybe three. I think three ways we can say. First is coincidence, pure coincidence. The fact that we get this experimental data that looks very much like exactly what Peter Higgs was talking about and writing about and predicting, it's coincidence. It's got nothing. The fact that he was able to do some scribbles on paper has got nothing to do with this. Or you could say, no, there is some connection here. Maths and the physical world are connected in some way. And then the third, I guess I'm trying to talk about randomness, stochasticity, determinism, and then chaos is not really a third one, but people like to think it is. It's just complex determinism, tricky determinism. So, yeah, and if it's deterministic, what I mean by that is, I mean, there is a correspondent relation there. There is a causal or a connection between our mathematical, like Eugene Wigner said, right, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. I think science has a lot of success to that, or technology. Is a tricky one, and it depends on many things. But I suppose at the end of the day, it's the predictions